All right. I want to thank you all for being here. Tonight's talk is going to be anxiety, depression, and sensory overload. Um, First off, ooh, that was interesting. Are we good now? We're getting a little feedback in here if you didn't hear that. Um, the anxiety and ADD I'll go over. I'm really going to key in on the sensory overload information. I haven't talked about this in probably 3 years at least. So I'm going to really dive in on this one. I'll go over the anxiety stuff, some of the indicators, what we look at, how we can help you balance it, the ADD, ADHD stuff, the different formats. But they all tie into the sensory information. If you can't integrate information correctly, then you're going to have some processing issues that will look like ADD, that will look like anxiety, and so forth. So, as always, please come with an open heart and an open mind, and let's dive right in. So, when we're talking about anxiety, what we want to look at is what are the symptoms that people can get with anxiety. So some of the symptoms we commonly see with anxiety are racing heart rate, muscle tension. The one we commonly see are worry loops or difficulty focusing. So what's a worry loop? So that's going to be like, I have to achieve this. Let's say I have to go to get milk. What's this say? And then you correlate milk with, well, my child can't drink milk. And then you start thinking about all the problems you're having with your child and get stuck in that. And then you go back to, oh no, I need to get milk. And you start going in this circle. So it's a loop or repetitive thing that does not get removed easily. So that can be an example of a worry loop. That can you can also have difficulty focusing because you have a thought stuck in your head. So I'll give an example of this. If you're first dating somebody and all you can do is think about them all the time, that's really difficult for you to focus on anything else in your life. So that's going to be one that everybody has experienced, but you can have the same difficulty focusing if you're in a worry loop. You can have the same difficulty focusing if you're in that anxious state, because what's happening is the back of your brain is actually running too fast. So when we look at the brain waves, and I haven't done this in a while, so I'll go over it again. We have beta, SMR, alpha, and theta. So beta is 13 to 38, SMR is 12 to 15, alpha is 8 to 12, and theta 3.5 to 8. Each one of these frequencies is going to determine how you perceive the world. Now, when I'm explaining this, I'm going to explain it for the frontal lobe, so executive center, how you feel day to day. But when we talk about one of the anxiety drivers, it's actually going to be in the subconscious. And that's that inability to focus and that worry loop information. So this is why some of the anxiety depression meds do not work, because only, let's see, 1/2 of what causes anxiety will be affected by the anxiety depression meds. The other 2 forms will not be affected by it. So you have to make sure that if you're having an issue, you know where the problem is, and then you take care of the actual problem. You don't just treat the symptom. Because if you just go after the symptom, it can make things worse. So racing thoughts, fast brain, that's beta. SMR, that's motor information processing. Alpha, being in the zone, in the flow. And then theta, subconscious relaxation, as well as new ideas. So in the back of your brain, or the subconscious, if you make too much beta and not enough theta, you'll get anxiety. You'll get racing thoughts. You'll have poor stress tolerance. Pharmaceuticals do not take care of this. The majority of our people that come in, probably 99%, have this problem right here that I'm talking about. And if we look at it, it's going to be usually O1 or O2. And it's going to be the theta over beta ratio. And we want that to be 1.8 to 2.2. So if that ratio is off, the lower it is, it means the more beta you have. So if you have, like, say, 1.0, that means you're half of where you need to be. That means your brain is racing twice as fast as it should be. And that's why you get anxiety. If you have this form of anxiety, what happens is you are prone to self-medicating behavior. So if you have a family that's prone to alcoholism or drug addiction or gambling or different things like that, this is the part of the brain that causes it. It's literally the back of the brain there. You go, well, why would that show up? If I have anxiety, why am I going to be prone to self-medicating? You just want a time to check out. You just want 10, 20 minutes, an hour, 2 hours where you feel calm and relaxed. And that drug of choice or action will give you that time to feel relaxed. But then it breaks down your body. So we don't want that for long periods of time. So what we want to do is actually change the brain waves. And if you can change it, then you'll see it stabilize. The pharmaceutical route is to actually, for anxiety people, is they give you antidepressants usually. So they'll give you a product that increases serotonin levels. Sometimes dopamine, but usually serotonin. And they go, look, you'll do better. Not really. It numbs you. You may feel a little better for a short period of time, but your body eventually figures out what's going on and deals with the drug, and that's why you have to keep taking more and more and more. That's why you switch in different things. You haven't gone after the actually underlying issue. So if we have a family who has addiction issues, the back of the brain is usually where we want to deal with it. So that is anxiety. The areas that are usually weak with anxiety is the middle part of the brain, called the amygdala, or the emotional center, and the prefrontal cortex, so the front of the brain. So the front of the brain's job is to calm down the brainstem, the midbrain. What we look at with anxiety is how is the balance between stress and relaxation. If you want to talk medical terms, how is the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic? And that lets us know how relaxed we actually are and how we're actually doing. Any questions on that? No? Cool. So the next one we're going to look at is ADD, ADHD. Now, ADD, ADHD, if you look at it from a purely EEG standard, there are cutoff levels. So in the middle part of the brain, the very top, that's where common ADD comes from. That's where the ADD that responds to Ritalin or stimulants will come from. So if you have ADD and you give the person caffeine and they do better, that's this part of the brain. So when we look at the brain, oh, that's a bad brain, but we'll deal with it. It's the very top here. What happens is, this is called the sensory motor cortex. That's when you take in information and process it. This part of the brain, if it is fatigued, will slow down. So what would happen if we slow down the processing center of the brain that processes information? We'll want to speed it up. We slow it down because we don't want to deal with the stress of our life, but then we want to speed it back up, which means we want stimulants or we want movement. Because this is the motor cortex, movement will stimulate that area. So if you have ADD, what we look at is the theta over beta ratio again, but if it's greater than 2.2, but less than 3.0, that's called ADD. But if it's greater than 3.0, that's called ADHD. So what does that mean? If you have double the theta to beta, that's called ADD. If you have triple the slow brain wave to the fast brain wave, that's called ADHD. So there's actually definitive things. When you look at the DSM or the diagnostic textbooks, they just look at symptoms. The problem with just looking at symptoms is you miss the underlying physiology. Because ADD can commonly look exactly like anxiety in the back of the brain. So the back of the brain, we need to slow you down to make you feel better. The top of the brain, we need to speed you up. So would there be a problem if you're diagnosed with ADD, but the back of the brain is the problem, and we give you a stimulant? Yeah, now you get the child who becomes suicidal. Now you get the person that when you give them ADD meds, literally becomes crazy because the back of the brain is speeding up even more, and that wasn't the problem. So now they become addicted to things. This is why when I was in school, you would see kids who were diagnosed with ADD. They weren't ADD. They had the back of the brain that was too fast, but they had the addictive personality. So they'd literally crack up their addictive or their ADD meds, their Ritalin, and then snort it and get high off of it because they're snorting speed. And we were seeing this in school. But it's because the symptom of anxiety in the back of the brain looks just like ADD. So if you've been bullied or you are scared about the environment around you, that looking around, that anxiety will look exactly like a kid who can't focus and is moving to try to calm down their brain. So you have to know what brain you're dealing with before you just start throwing meds at people. Because if you are dealing with the wrong brain, you can make a lot of problems. There's another form of ADD that I hope sometime in my lifetime that we can make most people aware of. This is pernicious or under-task ADD. And what that means is this form of ADD, the harder you try, the more your brain falls asleep. So this form will actually make you get tired the harder you try. So most people, I study really hard, I can remember stuff. With this form of ADD called under-task ADD, you literally, the harder you try, the more you get tired, the more you get distracted. So it's not about a lack of trying, it's what your brain does when you try. This form of ADD has an incarceration rate, or people that go to jail, of 90%. That means 90% of all the people in jail have this form of ADD. So if you heard what I just said, that means that if we can scan for this or look into schools and find out that children have this, you can literally preemptively change it. And that means that child will be able to study and get results instead of having to turn to crime, because the harder they try, the worse they do. So, and we found this out because in the neurofeedback circles, they literally scan the brains of inmates. And 90% of the people in jail have that form of ADD, which means the harder they try, the worse they do. So if we could scan it ahead of time, find out that child has it, then we know there's that predisposition. Change it, and now the child can work hard and go through school. So we'd love to. That's one of the things that I'd love to help take care of, is scanning kids to figure out if we can get rid of this. And I'd love to. Now, when we look at ADD, there are specific parts of the brain that will be affected, specifically the frontal lobe. And that's the part of the brain the motor cortex is at. So if the frontal lobe is weak, you get ADD. If the frontal lobe is strong, you don't get ADD. What else does the frontal lobe, or the frontal part of your brain, control? How smart you are, how well your immune system works, as well as how your body moves. So basically everything that's important to us. So that's the part of the brain that we want to keep healthy as long as possible. What part of the brain gets weaker as we age? The frontal part. What part of the brain is most easily damaged? The frontal part. What part is affected when you have immune problems? The frontal part. So if you see what I'm saying, your frontal lobe, your ability to think and literally control things through thought process, executive center, determines how healthy or long you're going to live. So that's why we see people who keep working into their elder years, they retire, but they keep doing stuff, live longer than the ones who sit in front of the TV and do nothing. You got to keep that frontal lobe going, or your immune system will fall apart. You got to keep that frontal lobe going, or your body won't work correctly. So that frontal lobe is literally your health. The other thing that you want to be aware of is the bonding ability of acetylcholine and dopamine, because ADD is considered a dopamine issue. The bonding ability of dopamine is determined by testosterone and DHEA, which are two hormones. So if your testosterone is not working correctly, dopamine will not bond correctly to the as a neurotransmitter to the neuron, and you will not have the proper stress management skills. So that's another thing to look at is, do we have proper DHEA or dopamine levels? So that's ADD. Do you have any questions on ADD? Now, this is the one that I haven't talked about in a while. This is the one that I really wanted to get into, and that is sensory overload. So what we need to understand is that when we are talking about sensory information, it's processed by different parts of the brain. So when we are born, we operate out of the brainstem. This is where reflexes happen. So I know we've all done this. You see the baby, you take your finger, you put it in the hand closes. Oh, that's so cute. That's literally a reflex. It's not baby loves you. It's literally a reflex so that baby will hold on to anything that touches its hands. There are other reflexes that you will see. There's what's called the rooting reflex, which means if you swipe the side of baby's mouth or nipple touches the side of baby's mouth, baby will turn head. There's another reflex called the 18R reflex, which is when you turn your head, your arm and leg will actually straighten out. Now, why am I bringing up that reflex? Because if this reflex does not integrate correctly, called the 18R reflex, you will not hear, see, smell, taste things correctly, because that reflex literally primes or makes the highway for your brain start working correctly. So if that reflex is not working correctly, we will literally not have ourselves develop correctly. When I'm going into the sensory aspect of what we're going to talk about now, understand that if you are somebody who is light sensitive, if you are somebody who is sound sensitive, if you are somebody that is touch sensitive, that tells us we've either had a trauma to our brain, chemically, emotionally, or physically, like a head injury, severe emotional trauma, something like that, or we didn't develop correctly and we missed some stages. What would cause us to not develop correctly? Same things that cause us to have issues that would not allow us to process emotional, physical, and chemical stresses. So we start off by processing from our brainstem. Then, as we grow, our brain grows from the bottom to the top, back to the front, right to left, and inside out like a flower. So what we want to look at is, how do we see how you're doing? When you come in, we test those reflexes that determine how your brain is developing. If we do the ones where we brush under your hands, on your face, we're actually testing brainstem. If you still feel that, that means that reflex is active, and it tells me the frontal lobe is not strong enough to inhibit that reflex, or the cerebellum is not strong enough to inhibit that reflex. That tells me we are stuck in fight or flight, because brainstem is fight or flight. And if you understand this, when the frontal lobe is not developed in babies, when they're first born, how easy is it to make a baby unhappy? You make a noise, they cry. They're hungry, they cry. You do anything, they cry. They're all or nothing. They're black and white. That's because they have no executive center. They have no whiteboard to put lots of information in. They can't process with that executive because it's not there. So when we look at this, we test primitive reflexes and withdrawal reflexes. Are they working correctly? Then we want to see, can the motor cortex turn off the brainstem, the fight-flight response? So we do things like, how can you walk? Can you walk in place? Can you go heel to toe? Can you do these things? Can you do these things eyes open? Can you do them eyes closed? If not, then we know we have a problem. So if we can't do them eyes closed, it tells me we're using our eyes and we're not using our cerebellum and our motor cortex to actually figure out what's going on. The motor cortex figures out how to do the action. The cerebellum does the action. So if your cerebellum is weak, then you're incoordinated. You trip, you fall, you don't have the coordination that you should have. If your motor cortex is off, then you can't make the actual movements. Wherever the head injury happened will affect that part of the brain. Now, the cool thing is the brain can rewire itself. So we test things like gross motor. How do you move? How do you walk? We test things like grip. How do you hold a pen? We test things like, can you do finger movements? This is telling us gross motor and fine motor. Then we're going to look at auditory, which is the side of the brain, which is processing auditory information, and that's correlated also to emotional. So auditory and emotional go hand in hand. So if you think about it, what are some of the things that chronically trigger people are going to be loud noises, which is brainstem, auditory, and so forth. Then we'll look at things like eye movement, which is very specific. It's going to be cerebellum, brainstem, frontal lobe, and so forth. But the creme de la creme, the one that if it works can help fix a lot of things, is frontal lobe. Is the frontal lobe working correctly? It can literally downregulate all the stress response. So how do we ask you that one? We actually have you do a visualization for us. If you can visualize in your head, you can do frontal lobe. This is why I ask you, tell me how to walk into this place. Tell me the color of this. Tell me, and you have to visualize. Wherever your eyes go tells me if you're using your frontal lobe or not. So if I ask you a question and your eyes go up to the right, you're making it up to the left, you're actually coming up with data. So this is how people can use lie detectors or eye movements, and they'll actually see what you're doing. So this is how the newest lie detectors or the show Lie to Me and different things work, is they literally have pictures and they say, oh, his eyes went up, he's making up things. Oh, his eye went to this side, he's actually telling the truth. So wherever the eyes go tells us, because the right side is creativity, that means making up stuff. The left side is data. You can't look to the left and lie, because when you're looking to the left, you're accessing the left frontal cortex. That's data oriented. So if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, you'll look up and you'll come up with data. If, on the other hand, your brain isn't able to process stimulation or information correctly, then we'll see you use other forms of processing. So then we'll see people look to the left or to the right on even keel. That means they're going to start using auditory. If they're really weak, they will start humming. They will have to listen to music to study. This means they're an auditory processor, but it means they're taking more energy than they should be. The creme de la creme, the most energy efficient, uses the least amount of energy, don't get angry easy, is frontal lobe, visual processing. If you have a child who has autism, they do not have visual processing. They're going to be stuck in physical or auditory. And you'll know based on how they process. So if they get stressed out and they start flapping, that means they're using kinesthetic. That means cerebellum, motor cortex. If they get stressed out and they start humming, that tells us, or making noises or clicking, that means they're auditory processing, they're using temporal lobe. Maybe there's somebody who, when they are processing, they need to fidget. That's fine motor. Maybe they need to move their tongue. That's fine motor. But fine motor takes a lot more energy than visual does. Maybe there's somebody who needs to walk and pace. That's gross motor. That's major movements. That takes a lot of energy. The most important and the best way to process is visual. So it goes visual, auditory, fine motor, gross motor, and then brainstem. This is the hierarchy of how you process. Visual takes the least amount of energy. So I'm just going to make up these numbers. Let's say visual takes 1 joule of energy. Auditory is going to take 10. Fine motor is going to take 100. Gross motor is going to take 1,000. Brainstem is going to take 10,000. So as you can see, it's going to take a lot more energy to process the world in fight or flight than just visualizing it in your head. So what does that mean? You have a limited amount of energy. Let's say that the most amount of energy you have in a day is 100,000 joules. I'm just making this up for ease of explanation. So if you have 100,000 joules and you're processing in brainstem, that means you can only process 10 things that whole day, and then you'll be done. You'll be tired. Let's say you're now in gross motor. Well, now you can process 100 things. Well, but a thing is what? Is eating, it's thinking, and all these things. Maybe you're in fine motor. Now you're into 1,000. Maybe auditory. Now we're seeing literally we can do 10,000. Maybe we go to visual. Now I can do 100,000 things in a day. So now you can see wherever the person is processing at, why they would fatigue easier. If they're processing and they're stuck in auditory, it's okay. They can process 10,000 things a day, but it's not as easy as visual. So the people will say to me, I want to come home and have energy at the end of the day. What they're telling me is I need to process at visual level. So now I have more energy. So at the end of the day, I'm just doing the things I like to do and I'm not tired. But if I'm using more energy, it's harder. I'll give you another analogy. Let's say we need to skin an apple. If we use visual, this is a scapula or a razor. So you can do it really well. If you use auditory, this is going to be a sharp knife, maybe one of those forged in fire knives or something. If you're doing fine motor, this is going to be a butter knife. So you can do it, but it's not as easy. If you're doing gross motor, now you're using a shovel to try to literally take the rind of an apple off. And then if you do brainstem or fight or flight, now you're using a sledgehammer. It is not going to work well. If we use a different analogy, you can use a car. You can see this isn't going to work really well. That's why when you're stuck in fight or flight, you fatigue easy. You get energy drained easy. You start being prone to addictions. You start having all these issues because you can't actually use the skills you're supposed to use. You fall apart real quickly. We all know that children will fall apart really quickly if we put a lot on them, and it's because they get their energy stores fatigued quickly. Because if they're really young, they're using maybe gross motor and brainstem. You ask them to do something, and all of a sudden they get really angry really quickly. It's because they drop into brainstem quickly. When they start being able to actually use visual, then they'll process better. So if you have sensory information issues, it just tells us where you're stuck. If you're stimming with movement things, like having to move a lot or you like touch or whatever, that's telling us it's in fine motor or gross motor. Gross motor is usually movement. If you're stimming with auditory, you're like hearing crunchy things or different things like that. That's telling us where you're stuck at. So you're stuck at, oh, I love listening to this. It makes me feel so calm. That's telling me you can only process an auditory and your visual isn't working correctly. Yes?
What does it mean if I get home after a long day and I still have energy, but I just have to like walk and process and I kind of like walk?
So the question is, at the end of the day, if I get home, I have energy, but I need to process, I need to walk, then you're using gross motor. Even if you have energy, it means you're using gross motor. But walking does activate frontal lobe. And as you walk, you'll move up and you'll recalibrate to visual. And then once you're done, it's just the longer you have to walk, the more you have to stim. So if you have to walk for 10 minutes, that's easy. If you have to walk for an hour, it tells us you're really gross motor dominant and you can't get back to frontal lobe visual. But if you're able to, walk up and down and you're fine, if you get home and you need to listen to music, it means your dominant processing is auditory. If you get home and you watch television, it means it's more going to be visual. So it tells us where you need to process based on where your stability is. If you get home and you're completely tired and you just need to go to bed and you're angry, it's probably brainstem. But as you develop, you'll get more to auditory visual. Your end goal is to get to visual. Because you can see, then you can process 100,000 things a day instead of only 10 things a day. 10 things a day isn't good. That means eating, going to the bathroom, falling asleep, and going waking back. That means that's your day, is basic tasks. But then as your brain becomes more functionable, it's able to process more things and it takes less energy. Does that make sense? Do you guys have any other questions? All right. So what I want you to understand is with sensory, there are different processing areas in the brain. The ultimate creme de la creme, the gold standard is visual. If you can do visual, you can process anything. Guess what gets turned off when you're stressed out? Visual. You turn off visual, then you start using auditory. If auditory gets turned off, temporal lobe, then you're going to start going to motor cortex and cerebellum. So if you look at it, you go frontal lobe, temporal lobe, cerebellum, anger. Then you start working correctly. Remember I said bottom up? Then you turn on cerebellum, you start moving. Ooh, I feel better. Ooh, I'm talking to somebody and moving. This is what walking does. That means you're doing auditory and motor at the same time. Oh, and I'm looking around and feeling happy. Maybe we put a little visual in there too. But if you notice in the office, what we do is we literally have things that will force you to use frontal lobes, which is the pictures we have here on the TVs are of outdoor and nature. That's a frontal lobe stimulator. That's a vagal stimulator. And we do it on purpose to make you be calm. That's why people are like, oh, when I come in here, I feel so calm. Yes, I'm aware. We did that on purpose. The color of the walls is on purpose to make you calm. The TVs and what they play is to make you feel calm. The music, all of that is to literally stimulate the right brain, make the brain relax. If you can make that frontal lobe stay on, that will keep you healthy and relaxed. So that's the key. If you find yourself needing to stim or push certain areas, sensation. So if you're like, oh, I only feel good when I get pinched, that's going to be a dopamine rush related to fine motor or gross motor. Or, oh, I only feel good when I hear certain noises. That's going to be a rush related to auditory. Or I only feel good when I watch certain things. That's going to be visual. So it's just going to show you where your processing centers are. Go ahead.
When you doom scroll, when you just scroll on your phone, is that visual still?
So doom scrolling is going to be visual, but you're also going to get hits of dopamine based on what you're looking at or reading. So that means you're so stressed out, you're trying to check out, and you're using visual and kinesthetic to do it. And you're getting hits of, ooh, I know that person. I wonder what's wrong with them. Or ooh, I know that. And you're literally doing the emotional thing in there as well. So it's a self-medicating behavior. It's a, I want to feel calm, so I'm just going to start looking at stuff. The eye thing is going to do it. Now, the other thing the screen does that most people aren't aware of is it pushes theta, the back of the brain, because of the frequency it fluctuates at. So if the back of the brain, the addiction area is what's causing the problem, and the screen's fluctuating, pushing brainstem in that subconscious, looking at the screen will actually stimulate you to be in a more relaxed state. But that's why when you take the screen away, you don't have that relaxation. Then you get anxious because now you don't have your, I'm making myself calm. Same as if I'm an addict, the alcohol makes me calm, but you take alcohol away, I don't have a coping mechanism anymore. The screen will do the same thing. All right. So I hope you guys got some good takeaways on ADD, anxiety, and sensory information. If you have a friend or family member who has any of these issues, there are ways to help them. If you have somebody who gets overwhelmed easily, is easily distracted, can't process certain stimuli, needs certain stimuli, we can test them. We can find out if it's something we can help them with. We do have our PAD, or Patient Appreciation Week, coming up the week of October 2nd. That's where it's a very cost-effective way to get them in. It's $20 for the full exam. But what I'm basically letting you know is there are other ways to get help besides pharmaceuticals. So if you want to go that way, we can help you. Think of that person, take a step, and get them checked. Thank you. Have a good night.